The night Brooke Lira Veyrathi walked barefoot through a roof of burning thatch, the woman who had raised her was already laying out the morning black she planned to wear at dawn. Velis had folded the gown 3 days before, in the slow, careful way she folded everything, and had tucked into its sleeve a sprig of dried mountain rue for show, because grief without a prop was harder to perform convincingly to a king's outriders. She had not expected the king himself, of course. Alpha King Karen's caravan was not supposed to have taken the high pass at all. The outriders had veered east when the storm broke against the ridge, and the lanterns of the hold had drawn them in the way lanterns draw moths and other doomed bright things. And Velis had stood in her doorway watching the banners come up the switchback, with her mouth gone dry and her hands very, very still. 12 years of work. 12 years of suppressant ash combed into a child's hair every 7th morning, of intercepted summons burned in the kiln behind the herb shed, of small relics fed in tea to her own daughters Kayleen and Nicole, so the heat ward would settle in their bones, instead of the bones of the foundling she had been ordered, in a voice she had never been allowed to refuse, to keep alive and keep hidden and keep wrong. 12 years, and now the Ash King was sleeping under her roof, and the only way to make the timing work was to make it work tonight. So she had gone down to the cellar where the dragon oil waited in its sealed clay, and she had carried the jar up the back stair with the careful posture of a woman carrying a sleeping infant, and she had poured it in a thin, glistening line along the threshold of Lyra's small attic room, and along the rafter directly above the bed where the girl slept curled like a question mark she had never been allowed to ask aloud. What Velis did not know, what no one in 3 generations had been left alive to remember, was that dragon oil does not behave like fire when it finally reaches what it recognizes. It behaves like a hand. It behaves like a voice saying, "At last, your name." The oil caught on the lintel and ran upward instead of down, against gravity and against sense, and the rafter went up in a sheet of pale gold so bright that for one heartbeat the whole hold was lit from within, as if a second sun had been buried under the mountain and was now climbing free. And Lyra opened her eyes inside that light and did not scream because the heat tasted somehow like a word she had been trying to remember her whole life. She sat up in a bed that was on fire and was not burning her. She put her bare feet on floorboards that should have been coals and felt, instead, only warmth. The warmth of a hand laid against the small of a back that had been cold for 23 years. The suppressant ash that Velis had patted into her scalp that morning. The same ash Velis had patted into her scalp every 7th morning since she was old enough to sit still for it, cooked off her skin in a thin gray shimmer and lifted toward the rafters and was gone. And with it went the dullness she had mistaken her whole life for the texture of being alive. Her chest, which had ached quietly for as long as she could remember, in a way she had always assumed was simple loneliness, was suddenly listening. Listening to what, she could not yet have said. Only that something very old and very far away had stopped humming a lullaby it had been humming under stone for 60 years, and had started, instead, to weep. She did not understand any of this. She only knew that outside her door a child was screaming. The stable-hand's small son, Joe, 6 years old and afraid of nothing in daylight, had been sleeping in the loft of the cottage 2 doors down because his mother Melanie was on night watch with a foaling mare, and the thatch of that cottage had caught from the embers blown off Lyra's own roof, and the loft beam had come down across the boy's legs and pinned him in a corner the smoke was already finding. Lyra heard him the way one hears a bell rung directly against the bone. She rose. She walked. Flame curled away from her ankles like a dog laying itself down at a familiar foot, and she did not think this was strange, because in the part of her that had just woken up, nothing had ever been strange, only delayed. She went through her own burning doorway and across the courtyard and into the cottage where Joe was, and she crouched in smoke that should have killed her in 3 breaths, and lifted the beam off his legs with hands that were not shaking, and she carried him out into the cold mountain air and set him down at his mother's feet. And only then did she permit herself to sit on the rim of the well and close her eyes for one long, listening moment, because something inside her chest was saying, "Finally, finally, finally," in a voice she did not yet know was not her own. When she opened her eyes again, the courtyard had gone very quiet, in the particular way crowds go quiet when they have just witnessed something the language they were raised in does not have a clean word for. Half the village was on its knees. The other half was standing perfectly still, with buckets of well water hanging forgotten at the ends of their arms. Melanie had her son crushed against her chest and was sobbing into his hair without sound, the way grateful people sometimes sob, as if any noise might cause the miracle to be reconsidered and rescinded. Lyra's nightdress was whole. The hem was not even smudged. Her hair, which Velas had braided that evening with the same suppressant ash worked into the parting, hung loose around her shoulders, and the parting was clean and pale, and the smell of her was different. The villagers nearest her could feel it without knowing what it was, a warmth that had nothing to do with the residual heat of the fire, a quiet pressure against the inside of the chest, like a chord struck on an instrument none of them had been taught to name. They pulled back from her, not in fear exactly, but in the old reflexive way a person steps back from a hearth that has been opened to feed it, the way one steps back from something that is now allowed to take up the space it needs. No one spoke. Velas stood frozen at the corner of the Hearth Festival platform, where she and her daughters, Kayleen and Nicole, had been arranged in their best wool, the 3 of them lit by the still-burning thatch behind them, like figures painted on a screen that had begun, without their consent, to be turned. Kayleen's mouth was open. Nicole's hand was at her throat. Velas's face had emptied so completely that for the first time in 12 years, her stepdaughter looked at her and saw nothing recognizable there. No sternness, no piety, no carefully measured affection, only the bare hollow of a woman watching a ledger she had been keeping in private suddenly read itself aloud in the wind. Lira did not look at her. Lira was looking, without meaning to, up toward the gallery of the guest wing on the far side of the courtyard, because something in her had turned that way the same way a compass needle turns, and there was nothing there but an empty arched window, and the dark behind it, and the faint sense, gone almost before she registered it, of having been seen. From the dark behind that window, Alpha King Karen stepped back 1/2 pace and let the curtain fall. He had come up to the gallery looking for his warhorse, which had broken tether in the storm, and he had stopped at the window because there had been a noise in the courtyard he could not at first place, a soft particular noise like a held breath being let out very slowly by the world. He had arrived in time to see a young woman walk out of a roof full of fire, carrying a child not her own. He had not felt the famous pull in his chest that other alphas spoke of, the recognition like a hand closing on a thread, because he had not been able to feel anything in that chamber of himself for 10 years, since the war wound at Kervethik had carved the second voice out of him with a blade dipped in the rare gray metal that wolves did not speak of above a whisper. The silence he had carried since then was the loudest thing about him, louder than the crown he wore lightly and the sword he wore not lightly at all. He had assumed, for 10 years, that the silence was simply emptiness. He understood, standing at that window with the curtain still warm against his fingers, that it was not. The silence inside him had gone still in a new way when she set the child down. not louder, not filled, only attentive, the way a long empty room becomes a different shape when a single candle is lit at the far end of it. He did not go down to the courtyard. He did not announce himself. He watched until she lifted her face briefly toward the gallery without seeing him, and then he stepped back and walked along the unlit corridor to his rooms and woke his second, a gray-haired man named Aldrich, who had been sleeping fully dressed at the foot of his door, and said very quietly, "My horse at first light, and not a word to anyone in this hold, and find me before we cross the second pass. Every record this region has ever sent or refused to send to the capital concerning bloodline survivors of any erased line." Aldrich, who had served 3 kings and learned long ago not to ask the obvious questions, only nodded once and went. Karen stood for a long time at his own dark window after that, listening to the silence inside himself, the way a man listens to a door that has, for the first time in a decade, made a sound on the other side. He rode away at dawn without a word to anyone in the hold, and Lira, who had been moved by the village women into Melanie's own warm kitchen and wrapped in 3 blankets she did not need, did not see him go. She heard the hooves on the cobbles and the quiet murmur of Aldrich ordering the gate opened, and she did not get up. She was holding a clay cup of broth she had not tasted, and across the table from her, Melanie was sitting with Joe asleep in her lap, and neither woman was speaking, because what had happened in the courtyard was not the kind of thing that could be spoken about yet, only sat next to. Velis came in once, at the edge of dawn, with her face arranged back into its usual configuration of stern competence, and said in a voice that was almost steady, "You should rest, dear." And Lira looked up at her over the rim of the untouched cup, with eyes that had not yet learned how to be different, and yet were already different. And Velis felt, for the first time in the 12 years of this work, something cold move down the back of her neck. She did not stay long. She withdrew to her records room and closed the door and sat at her writing desk and did not, for a long while, do anything at all. In the days that followed, the hold tried to put itself back together around an event no one would describe in plain words. The Thatchers came up from the lower village and rebuilt 3 roofs. Melanie brought Lira a small carved wooden horse her son had whittled badly and pressed it into Lira's palm without speaking, and walked away before Lira could thank her. The mountain doves that had nested under the eaves of the burned cottage came back and sat on the new straw as if nothing had happened. And one of them, a small dust-colored female with a chip in her beak, took to following Lira around the herb garden, landing on the handle of her trowel, on the rim of her water bucket, on the curve of her shoulder when she knelt to weed. Lira named her, after a few days, Brooke, for no reason she could articulate, except that the name had risen in her the way a name rises when one has been waiting for the right small thing to give it to. The dove followed her everywhere. Velis watched the dove with a tightness around her mouth that her daughters Kayleen and Nicole both noticed and neither commented on, because Kayleen and Nicole had spent the week since the fire revisiting, in the silence of their own heads, every tea their mother had ever pressed on them, every charm she had pinned inside their collars, every careful instruction about how to stand and how to be seen, and were beginning, separately, to feel ill in a way neither of them yet had the courage to name. 6 weeks after the fire, a rider in the King's Grey arrived at the hold's outer gate with a sealed writ. Velis met him at the threshold with the smile she kept for envoys, but he did not hand the writ to her. He asked, formally, for Lira of the Hold by name, and when Lira came down the stair in her ordinary working dress with the dove Brooke on her shoulder, the rider knelt and gave the writ into her own hands and waited while she broke the seal. The wax was the color of old blood and stamped with a crest Lira did not recognize, and that Velis behind her did. The writ named Lira to a succession right she had never been told existed, in a line she had never been told she belonged to, and required her presence in the capital within 20 days under the king's own protection. Lira read it twice. She did not look at Velis. She folded the writ carefully and said to the writer, "I will come." Velis said that night across the supper table, in the calm tone of a woman explaining a small misunderstanding, "You must understand, child, that these summons go out by the dozen to anyone with a rumor of old blood, and most of them are mistakes." Lira looked at her over the bread and said, "Then I shall go and be a mistake in person." Kayleen, who had been Velis's favorite, set down her spoon. Nicole, who had been Velis's second favorite, did not pick hers up. Brooke the dove, perched on the back of Lyra's chair, put her head under her wing, and the kitchen was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. And Velis understood, with the clarity of a woman watching a ledger she has kept in private finally be opened by a hand that is not hers, that she had, perhaps, 8 days to act, and that none of the actions available to her were good ones. The journey down from the high pass took 11 days, and Lira, who had never in her life traveled further than the lower market, sat the small mountain pony the king's men had brought for her with a stiff back and an outwardly composed face, and an inwardly bewildering sense of being walked, rather than walking, toward something that had been waiting a long time. The king's escort was small, deliberately small. 6 riders under Aldrich's command, and they treated her not as a curiosity and not as a prisoner, but with the specific, careful courtesy reserved for people whose status has not yet been formally announced, and whose comfort the man who sent them has made plain is to be guarded as if it were already his own. Aldrich himself rode a half-length behind her shoulder and spoke little, and when he did speak, it was to point out, in the dry tone of an old soldier who has noticed everything, the small pleasures of the road, a particular bend in the river where the trout rose at dusk, a stand of late autumn medlars whose fruit could be eaten if one had the patience to wait for the frost to soften them. He did not ask her about the fire. He did not ask her about the hold. Once, on the 7th evening, she asked him, quietly over the campfire while the others were seeing to the horses, why the king had sent for her in particular and not, since the writ named a line and not a person, also for her stepsisters. And Aldrich considered the fire for a long moment and said only, "The king sends for what he sends for, my lady, and finds, in time, that he has reasons." The dove Brooke, who had refused to be left behind and had ridden the 11 days perched on the pommel of Lyra's saddle with the unconcerned patience of a creature who has decided where she belongs, opened one eye at this and closed it again, and Aldrich, watching the dove, almost smiled. The capital, when it came into view on the 12th morning, was not what Lira had expected. She had expected fortifications and noise and crowds. She found instead a city built low along a wide, pale river under a sky so high and clean it made her dizzy, with roofs of weathered green copper and gardens climbing the inner walls in tiers, and the king's hold itself a long, quiet building of gray stone that seemed less to dominate the city than to lean into it, the way a tall, older sibling leans toward a younger one in a family portrait. She was brought in through a side gate without ceremony. She was given a room that was too large, and a bath that was too hot, and a dress of deep, undyed wool that fit her, unnervingly, as if it had been measured to her by someone who had watched her cross the courtyard at the hold. She was allowed to sleep and to eat, and on the second evening she was brought, alone, by a quiet maid who curtsied at every doorway, into the king's private study, where a fire was burning low, and a man she had never formally met was sitting in a chair on the far side of it, reading. He looked up when she came in. He did not stand at once. He looked at her the way a man looks at a page he has been searching for in a long book and has just, after weeks of turning, found. Then he stood, because courtesy required it, and he said, "My Lady Lira." And the way he said her name was not a caress and not a claim, only a careful placing of it into the air between them, the way one might place a small bowl of water down for a creature one does not wish to startle. He asked her, that first evening, about the hold. Not about the fire, about the hold, about the herb garden she had run, which herbs she had favored for fevers and which for grief, about the records room and what shape the ledgers were kept in, about the lower village and its market days and what the children there did in winter. He listened to her answers with the complete still attention of a man who had been waiting a long time to hear a particular voice speak in an ordinary room about ordinary things. And Lira, who had spent her whole life being half listened to by a stepmother whose attention was always angled past her towards some other purpose, found herself talking longer than she had meant to, and more honestly, and at one point laughing, briefly, at her own description of old Hesta the goat, and then stopping in surprise at her own laugh, and Karen, on the other side of the fire, did not smile, but the silence inside his chest did something that, had it had a face, would have been very close to smiling. He did not tell her that evening that he had been at the gallery window. He did not tell her that evening what his archivist had been doing for the past 6 weeks along the border way stations and in the cloister archives at Denham, where the dragon oil had been traced. He only thanked her, when the hour grew late, for her time, and said, "If it is not unwelcome, my lady, I would be glad of your company again tomorrow." And Lira, who had not been asked her preference about anything for a very long time, said yes, and meant it, and went back to her too large room and sat for a long while on the edge of the too soft bed, with the dove brook asleep on the windowsill, and tried to understand why a man she had met for 1 hour had made her feel, for the first time in her life, like a person whose voice was a thing that arrived somewhere when she spoke it, instead of a thing that fell, unheard, into the floor. The weeks that followed were not what either of them had been told to expect of such weeks. The court had been told that the king was conducting an inquiry into a possible Vairathi survivor, and the court, being a court, had immediately divided itself into factions about it, and a particular high-born woman named Lady Sareth, who had spent her entire life understanding herself to be the most likely future queen, and who had 3 older brothers and a mother with very specific opinions about bloodline purity, had taken the news in the cool, composed way of a woman already drafting letters. Lira knew none of this, because Karen had quietly arranged that she would not yet be presented to the court at large. She was given the freedom of the inner gardens and the lower library, and a small still room off the kitchens, where she was permitted, at her own shy request, to grind herbs again, because her hands had begun to ache from the unfamiliarity of having nothing in them. She and Karen met, at first, only in the evenings in his study, and then, after the first week, also in the mornings in the lower library, where he was rebuilding, with 3 of his archivists and a great many trestle tables, the 12 years of intercepted summons that had been traced, slowly and patiently, to a kiln behind a herb shed in a particular hold high in the eastern mountains. He did not, at first, tell her whose kiln it was. He showed her the seals, and the partial wax fragments, and the careful charts his people had made of which envoys had been sent on which dates, and which had returned with which non-answers. And he asked her, in the quiet way he asked everything, whether she recognized any of the seals. Kira, shaking on the tangible one of them immediately, because she had seen Valus melt down a seal exactly like it in the kiln behind the herb shed 3 winters ago, and had been told, when she asked, that it was an old courier's mark of no importance. She said so. Karen did not react beyond a small, slow nod. He moved the fragment to one side of the table. He did not say then what he was building. He only continued, for several mornings, to lay out the evidence around her in the patient way one might lay out the pieces of a broken bowl around the person who, without yet knowing it, owns the bowl. In the evenings, by the fire in his study, they spoke of other things. He told her, on the fourth evening, about Kervethic, in the brief, economical way a man tells the worst thing that has ever happened to him, when he has decided the listener can be trusted with it. He told her about the rare gray metal and the wound at the base of his throat, and the silence that had followed, and the way other alphas had stopped meeting his eye in council afterward, as if his lack of a second voice were a contagion they might catch. He did not perform it. He simply set it down between them, the way she had set down 2 evenings earlier, the small leather pouch of suppressant ash she had carried since childhood, because she had been told it was medicine for her fire-cursed condition. They had set those 2 objects, the wound and the pouch, on the same low table between their 2 chairs without comment, and they had looked at each other across them, and Lira had understood, quite suddenly and without the help of any pull or hum or thread inside her chest, that she had spent her whole life being managed by someone who did not love her, and that he had spent his last 10 years being subtly avoided by people who did, and that this was not the same loneliness, but it was a loneliness fluent in the same language. She had not reached for him. He had not reached for her. They had simply sat on either side of those 2 small, terrible objects and breathed. And after a while she had said, in a voice that surprised her, "Do you ever resent the silence?" And he had considered this for a long time and said, "I used to." And she had said, "And now?" And he had said, "Now I find that it is, occasionally, capable of listening," and had looked at her, and Lyra's hands in her lap had gone very warm, not with the dragon warmth that had walked her through fire, but with the ordinary warmth of a body that has just remembered, after a long forgetting, that it is allowed to want. She did not, that evening, do anything about it. Neither did he. They were learning, both of them, that the absence of a bond pull was not, as the world had taught them, a deprivation. It was a permission. They were going to have to choose this, if they chose it, with their open eyes. And they were both, in their separate rooms that night, slow, careful people who had reasons not yet to choose anything. And so they did not. Yet. But the dove brook, perched on the windowsill of Lyra's chamber, fluffed herself and settled, and on the other side of the keep, the king sat for a long time at his own dark window, listening to the silence inside his chest do the new attentive thing it had begun to do 6 weeks ago in a mountain courtyard, and did not, this time, mistake it for emptiness. The first interrupted moment came on a night when neither of them had been expecting anything to be interrupted, because neither of them had been expecting anything to begin. Lira had stayed late in the study because Karen had asked her, almost diffidently, whether she would help him sort a particular sheaf of reports from the cloister at Thenham, and she had said yes. And they had worked side by side at the long table for 3 hours, with the fire burning low, and at some point her sleeve had brushed his wrist as she reached for a different page. And neither of them had moved, and the small contact had remained, sleeve against wrist, for the length of a slow breath, and then another. And then she had set the page down and turned her head to look at him, and found that he was already looking at her. And his hand had lifted, very slowly, with the same care he used for everything, and had come to rest at the edge of her jaw, his thumb just under the line of her cheekbone, not pulling her toward him, only there, asking. And Lira, who had never in her life been asked such a question by a hand, had leaned by the smallest possible degree, into his palm. And his eyes had darkened, and he had begun to bend his head toward hers, and the door of the study had been struck 3 times in the brisk, impatient pattern of a herald who had been told to wait and had not waited. "They had broken apart by an inch," he had said, in a voice that was almost steady. "Enter." And the herald had come in with a sealed message from the southern gate, and Karen had read it, and dismissed the herald and turned back to her, and the moment had been gone, the way such moments are gone. But he had said, quite simply, "My lady, I will not pretend that did not happen, and I will not insist that it must happen again." And Lira had said, "Neither will I," and had left the study with her hands shaking in a way they had not shaken when she carried Joe out of the burning cottage. Because the heat of dragon oil was an old familiar heat she had not known she knew, and the heat of being chosen, slowly, by a man who had decided to choose her without the help of any voice inside himself, was a new heat she had no language for at all. The next morning he was waiting for her in the lower library with a particular folder on the trestle table that he had not previously shown her, and he opened it without speaking, and inside it was the reconstructed paper trail of a single name, written in a hand Lira recognized immediately, because it was the hand that had written every household ledger of her childhood, the hand that had inscribed her own name into the hold's record of children, with the small notation "firecursed" in the margin, when she was 13 and had failed to undergo the ordinary shifter transformation. The name Valis had used in correspondence with the cloister at Thenum was not her own household name, but the looping V at the start of it was unmistakable, and the long, careful tail of the final S was the tail Lira had been taught to make at her stepmother's elbow at the age of 6. Lira looked at the folder for a long time. Brooke, the dove on her shoulder, made a small sound. Karen did not speak. After a while, Lira said in a voice that was perfectly level, "She has been buying dragon oil from the Thenum cloister for 20 years. And Karen said, "She has been buying it for 23. And Lira said, "The hold matron of a small mountain village does not have the coin for that." And Karen said, "No, she has been receiving the coin from a backer whose seal we have also identified." And he turned the page of the folder, and Lira saw a wax fragment in deep red and a name beside it, the name of a noble house she had never heard of, the house of Lady Sereth, the woman she had not yet been presented to and did not yet know existed. And Karen said gently, "This is what I have been building, my lady, and I needed you to see it before anyone else did, because what you do with it is yours." Lira sat down, because her knees had decided on their own that sitting was now necessary, and she put her face in her hands, not weeping, only breathing. And Kieran did not touch her, only sat in the chair opposite hers and waited. And after a while, she lifted her face and said, "The lullaby." He said, "What lullaby?" She said, "She used to hum a lullaby over my cradle. I have hated that lullaby my whole life, and I have never known why." He looked at her, and something in his face shifted, the way the face of a man shifts when a piece he had not known was missing slides into place. And he said, "My lady, would you be willing, when the right is held, to tell that detail to the court?" And she said, "Yes." And then she said, after a moment, "And would you, before the right, hold my hand once in a corridor where no one is watching, because I would like, before all of this becomes very large, to have done one small ordinary thing." And he stood, and he came around the table, and he took her hand in the corridor outside the lower library with no one watching except the dove Brooke, and they stood there together for the length of a slow breath, and then another, and then they let go and went on with the work. The day of the rite came in the slow, inevitable way the day of any rite comes, with too many people in too much fabric and too much polished metal in the great hall, and the air so heavy with incense and tension that Lira, walking the long aisle in the deep, undyed wool dress that had been remade for her with a panel of dark green at the throat, was glad of the dove Brooke tucked into the inner pocket she had insisted the seamstress add, because the small, warm weight of the dove against her ribs was the only thing in the room that felt the size she was used to. Lady Soreth was in the front row of the noble gallery in pale gold, beautifully composed, her face arranged into the precise neutrality of a woman who has been told that the inquiry is a formality, and that the foundling will be exposed and dismissed, and the proper order of things resumed before sunset. Valus had been brought down from the mountain hold 10 days earlier under quiet escort, ostensibly as a witness to Lyra's upbringing, and was seated, with her 2 daughters, Kayleen and Nicole, in a side gallery from which she could see the dais, and from which Karen's archivists, who had been instructed in the matter, could see her. Karen sat on the high seat in the dark gray of state, with the silver circlet that was lighter than it looked, and when Lira reached the foot of the dais, he did not smile at her, because the form of the rite did not permit it, but his eyes met hers for one steady beat, and the silence inside his chest did the new attentive thing, and Lira breathed once and was steady. The herald began the reading of the writ. The forms were observed. The witnesses were called. And then, instead of moving directly to the question of bloodline as the court had expected, Karen lifted one hand and the master archivist stepped forward with a leather folder, and the king said in his quiet, carrying voice, "Before the rite proceeds to its sacred portion, the court will hear an accounting in the matter of the 12 years of intercepted summons concerning the Vairathi line, the matter of the dragon oil purchased from the cloister at Thenham, and the matter of the household of Lady Soreth of the House of Marineth." The hall went absolutely still. Lady Soreth's face did not move, but the color beneath it changed. Valus's hands, folded in her lap, tightened. The archivist began to read. He read for nearly an hour. He read the dates of the summons and the names of the envoys and the kiln behind the herb shed, and the looping V and the long, careful tail of the final S. He read the ledgers of the Thenham cloister, and the dates of the dragon oil shipments and the seals on the receipts, and the names attached to those seals. He read the records of the relics, and the heat-word charms that had been quietly fed to 2 young women in a mountain hold over the course of 12 years, in the hope that one of them might, at the necessary moment, be mistaken for a lost line. He read the household accounts of the House of Marineth and the cross-referenced dates of the coin that had been moved to a small mountain hold via 3 way stations and a particular merchant named Halric, who had given full testimony in exchange for a quiet exile. He read, finally, the deposition of Kayleen of the Hold, who had presented herself of her own volition at the king's seat 8 days earlier and had asked to be heard, and had described in plain words the tease her mother had pressed upon her, and the charms pinned inside her collar, and the particular small carved figure she had been given on her 13th birthday, and had never understood. The archivist closed the folder. The hall did not breathe. Lady Soreth, in the front row of the noble gallery, opened her mouth once and closed it again, because there was nothing to say that the document had not already said. And a polished insider whose entire power consists of being above the kind of accounting that touches other people does not survive, in any practical sense, being read aloud. Valus, in the side gallery, sat very still, and Kayleen, beside her, did not look at her, and Nicole, on her other side, was weeping quietly into a folded handkerchief. And the guards, who had been positioned in advance, stepped forward at a small nod from Aldrich, and laid hands upon Lady Soreth's wrists and upon Valus's shoulders, and the matter, in the language of the court, was done. There was no fire. there was no flame from Lyra's hands. There was no climactic blast of silver or golden light. There was only a folder, read aloud in open court, by a man who had spent 6 weeks rebuilding it, on behalf of a woman who had spent 12 years being managed by it. The villain was not struck down. The villain was simply and irreversibly written down. Lyra, standing at the foot of the dais with the Dove Brook warm against her ribs, watched her stepmother's face empty in the way it had emptied in the courtyard the night of the fire, and felt, instead of triumph, a very clear, quiet sadness, because mercy, she was learning, was not the absence of consequence. It was the choice not to add anything to the consequence that the truth itself was already delivering. She did not speak. She did not need to. Karen, on the high seat, lifted his hand again, and the right, having been cleared of its falsifications, was permitted, finally, to proceed to its sacred portion. And the heralds turned, and the great doors at the back of the dais were opened, and the long stairway down into the vault beneath the Capitol was lit, lamp by lamp. And Lyra, who had been told what waited at the bottom only the night before, gathered her skirts in one hand and the dove against her ribs with the other, and began, with Karen beside her, to descend. The vault beneath the Capitol had been built 60 years earlier as a war trophy chamber, and although the trophies had been removed long ago, the chains had not, because the chains were holding the trophy that had not been removable. The chamber was vast and circular and roofed with a single dome of gray stone fitted without mortar, and the air in it was warm, not with the warmth of fire, but with the slow, ancient warmth of a body that had been breathing in that space for 60 years. The dragon was old. He was very old. His scales, which had perhaps once been the color of beaten copper, were the color now of long-faded rust, and the membrane of his half-furled wings was thin and torn in places like old parchment. And one of his great eyes was filmed entirely white and the other was clouded, and the chains at his neck and his foreleg were of the rare gray metal that wolves did not speak of above a whisper. And where the chains touched him, the scales beneath had worn through to a soft gray skin that looked like the skin of a creature who has been touched too long in the same place by something that does not love him. He was lying on his side when they came down the long stair, with his head on his foreleg and his good eye closed. He did not lift his head when the heralds entered. He did not lift his head when the priests of the rite arranged themselves in the half-circle the rite required. He did not lift his head when Karen stepped down onto the floor of the vault, although the silence inside Karen's chest did the attentive thing more loudly than it had ever done it. He lifted his head when Lyra reached the bottom of the stair. Not all the way, only by an inch. The good eye opened. The clouded eye, which the priests had told Lyra was blind, also opened and turned slowly toward her. The Dove Brook, against Lyra's ribs, made a small sound that was not a coo, and was not a cry, and was something Lyra had never heard a bird make. Lyra walked across the vault floor. She did not hurry. She did not slow. She walked the way she had walked across the burning courtyard 6 months ago, with her bare feet flat against the stone, and her chest open, and her hands at her sides. And when she reached the place 10 paces from the great old head, she stopped, because she did not know what the rite required next, and because something in her chest had begun to listen with such intensity that she was not sure her ribs would hold it. The dragon looked at her. He did not roar. He did not rise. His great head, which could have crushed her with a single careless motion, lowered toward her by a degree, and a sound came out of him that was not a roar and was not a growl, only a long, low, broken exhalation that ended, almost, in a note. And then, in a voice that was not a voice, but was the slow vibration of an enormous old throat shaping a sound it had been shaping in private for 60 years. He hummed. He hummed 3 notes. He hummed 3 notes, and then 4, and then the simple bent phrase that completed the line. And Lira, 10 paces from him on the cold stone floor of the vault under the Capitol, recognized the lullaby that her stepmother Velis had hummed over her cradle every night of her infancy to suppress her. The lullaby Lira had hated her whole life without ever knowing why. And she understood, with the clarity of a single bell struck in a room that had been silent for 23 years, that it was not the lullaby she had hated. It was being hummed at by the wrong throat, with the wrong intention, in the wrong direction. The lullaby itself was older than Velis. The lullaby itself was a lineage call, a cradle song the Veyrathi line had hummed to their bonded beasts for 9 generations. A sound Velis had stolen from a record she should have burned and used as a leash. And the great old creature in the vault had heard it through the stone of the Capitol for 12 years, faintly, distantly, wrongly hummed by the wrong woman in a kitchen a mountain away, and had been waiting, with the slow patience of a being whose lifespan is measured in centuries, for the right throat to hum it back. Lira did not hum it back. She knelt. She knelt on the cold stone of the vault floor, and she put one hand flat against it, and she said in a voice that was small and clear and entirely her own, "I did not know. I am sorry. I did not know." The dragon lowered his great head the rest of the way and rested his jaw on the stone 6 paces from her, and from the corner of his clouded eye a single thick, slow tear, the size of Lira's fist, ran down the worn scale of his cheek and pooled on the floor and steamed faintly in the warm air. He wept. The last living dragon, chained beneath the Capitol for 60 years, wept in recognition not of her blood and not of her scent, but of an apology hummed in the right direction at last, and the priests of the right, who had expected fire and had prepared themselves for fire, lowered their hands and stood with their faces uncovered, and Karen, who had not moved from the foot of the stair, came forward then, slowly, and knelt beside her on the stone, and said very quietly, only for her, "My lady, what would you have us do?" And Lira, with her hand flat against the warm stone, and her cheek wet, and the dove brook trembling against her ribs, said, in a voice she had never used before, but recognized at once as the voice she had been waiting her whole life to be allowed to use, "Take the chains off him." And Karen rose and gave the order, and the chains of rare gray metal that had held the last living dragon for 60 years were struck from his neck and his foreleg, one by careful one. And the great old creature did not rise and did not roar. He only laid his head down further on the stone and closed his good eye and breathed out, slowly. And the warm air of the vault moved, and somewhere far above them, in the great hall, those still seated felt the floor under their feet sigh, and did not know why. He did not fly away. He could not. His wings were too torn and his bones too old, and the sun, when at last they opened the great upper doors of the vault to let in light he had not seen in 60 years, made him close both his eyes against it like a creature receiving a blessing he had stopped expecting. They built him a sheltered enclosure in the south garden of the keep, open to the sky, with a long, shallow pool he could lay his throat into. And Lira went to him every morning before breakfast and sat on the low wall beside his head and read aloud to him from whatever book she happened to be reading. And the dragon, who was named, in the oldest records the archivists could find, Vethrax the Patient, listened with both eyes closed and his great old jaw on the stone, and seemed to like best the household accounts and the herbal treatises, perhaps because they were the kind of small, ordinary speech he had been starved of for 60 years. He lived in that garden for 2 more years, and when he died, on a quiet morning in early spring, with Lyra's hand on the worn ridge of his brow, and Karen standing behind her with his hand on her shoulder, he died with his good eye open and fixed on her face, and the last sound he made was not a roar and not a hum, but a small, contented exhalation, the sound of a creature setting something down at last. They buried him under the south garden, and they planted, above him, a slow-growing tree of the kind his species had once nested in. And the tree took, and grew, and was, in the years that followed, the place where the children of the household liked best to nap in the long summer afternoons. There were children by then. The first was a daughter, born in the second autumn after the rite, with Karen's gray eyes and Lyra's careful mouth, and a thatch of dark hair that she lost in her second month and grew back the precise color of beaten copper. They named her Melia, after no one in particular, because Lyra had had enough, in her own life, of being named after expectations, and wished her daughter to be named only after the sound of the name itself. The second was a son, born 2 years later, who had Lyra's gray eyes and Karen's careful mouth and slept from his first week in any patch of sunlight he could find. The dove brook lived to see them both and died on the windowsill of Lyra's chamber on a warm afternoon when Melia was 5, with the small dust-colored female's chipped beak tucked under her wing and her small body warm and still. And Melia, who had loved her with the uncomplicated ferocity of small children, wept for 3 days and would not be consoled. And then, on the 4th day, climbed into her father's lap in the south garden under the slow-growing tree and asked him, very seriously, whether dying was always a sad thing. And Kieran, who in the years since the rite had relearned how to feel many things he had thought were gone from him, considered the question with the full attention he gave to everything his daughter said, and answered, "Only sometimes, my heart, and only at first." Valus was not executed. Lyra had asked, at the rite, that she be exiled instead, to a small religious community far to the north where she would be required to spend the remainder of her life copying, by hand, the records of the Veyrathi line into the new archive Karen was building, and there she lived, in a small cell with a small writing desk, until she died 11 years later of an ordinary fever, and the records she copied in her looping V and her long, careful tale of the final S were the records that the next generation of scholars would use to study the line she had spent 12 years trying to erase, which Lyra had thought, when she chose the punishment, was a kind of poetry, and which Karen had said, when she explained it, was the cleanest justice he had ever heard described. Kayleen, who had testified, was given a small holding of her own near the river and married, in time, a quiet man who made furniture and visited the capital twice a year and was welcomed with warmth by her stepsister, and brought, on each visit, a small carved object for the children, which they treasured. Nicole, who had not testified, but had not lied either, took religious orders of her own choosing, and was happy, in the careful, measured way she had always been happy. Lady Sareth was stripped of her house's seat on the council, and required to remain on her family's distant estate, and she lived, by all accounts, in cold, composed bitterness for the rest of her days, and was not invited to the wedding. The wedding was small. It was held in the south garden under the slow-growing tree, with Vethrax the patient still living and lying along one wall of the garden, with his good eye open and watching, and the priests of the old rite presiding, in a form that had been simplified at Lyra's request. And the vows spoken between Lyra and Karen were not the standard vows of the court, but vows they had written between them in his study one evening, with the fire burning low, and a sheet of paper between them, and a single pen passed back and forth. And the vow said, among other things, "I will choose you tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. And not because anything inside me compels me to, but because I have looked, and I have listened, and I have decided." They had kissed for the first time, fully, 3 weeks before the wedding, in a corridor outside the lower library with no one watching except the dove Brooke, who had landed on the windowsill and turned her back politely. They had not been interrupted that time. They had taken their time. And now, on a quiet morning many years after the rite, Lira stood at the kitchen window of the small private wing of the keep where the family lived when they were not being the family of state, and watched her husband in the south garden, helping their son climb the lower branches of the slow-growing tree above the place where the dragon was buried, and watched her daughter Melia sitting cross-legged on the low wall with a household ledger open in her lap, copying in a careful, childish hand the small, ordinary entries of a kitchen account, and felt, in her chest, the warmth of a body that had spent its first 23 years cold, and had spent every year since, slowly, deliberately, freely warm. She set down her cup of tea. She went out into the garden. Her husband looked up when she came, and the silence inside his chest did the attentive thing. And her daughter looked up, and her son looked up, and the dove on the windowsill, who was a different dove now, a small gray female with no chip in her beak, whom Melia had named Brooke after the first one, ruffled her feathers and settled. And that was the shape of the life they had chosen, with their open eyes, on the far side of a fire that had burned away every lie they had been raised inside. And there was no pull, and no thread, and no hum, and no destined recognition. Only the slow, ordinary, daily decision of two people who had each lived inside a particular silence, choosing, again and again, to keep listening to the other one, and finding, each time, that the silence was capable of more than they had ever been told it was. If you have made it this far with me, dear listener, I would love to know where on a scale of 1 to 10 this story landed in your chest. So leave that number for me in the comments below. And if the slow burn of this one warmed you even a little, please do consider subscribing to the channel, because there are many more long, quiet stories like this waiting to be told, and I would very much like to tell the next one to you.